IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Sri Krishna Upadhyaya, and my guest today on the show is Priya Vora. Priya is the Chief Executive Officer at the Digital Impact Alliance based out of Washington in US. Welcome on the show, Priya. Very happy to have you today.
Great. Thank you for having me.
All right, Priya. So I think the first question I had for you is if you could tell us a little bit about the work you guys do at the Digital Impact Alliance, or DIAL as you call it. And for the benefit of our listeners, could you tell us, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? What is what you're doing about it? And what is the larger mission and vision of your organization?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again for having me. I'm really privileged to be here and sit in Digital Impact Alliance, which was founded about 7, maybe 8 years ago now, as more and more international funders were anticipating putting more money into digital systems, the kind of horizontals that support modern economies. 8 years ago, many of them were just starting out creating their digital development strategies, their teams, and they really recognized how important it was to have an organization that both can help them think through the strategies and priorities, but also should be shining the light on how they can be coordinated and more coherent as funders together. And I think, as you get into the issues of foreign assistance, you realize that a lot of the magic comes when more and more partners are cohering around a common vision, around common theory of change. And because digital is somewhat new in the foreign assistance landscape, there just wasn't that body who could really help donors come together in that same way. So that's really why DIAL was set up. That, of course, was now seems like eons ago. Most bilateral funders have digital strategies. You're seeing the World Bank elevate the issues of digital under their new president. Of course, the landscape has really changed. So a lot of the work we do is not just on the donor side, but also increasingly on government. So I'll give you a specific example. We really believe that issues of data architecture and data governance are at the heart of whether, people are really benefiting in the digital future. There's a lot of power dynamics around who holds the data, wields a lot of power. And so we've been doing research around how different countries have approached issues of data exchange. India, of course, stands out as this incredible example of trying to empower people with data as kind of a strategic asset. And we take that body of research, we share that both with funders as they think about their funding strategy, but also increasingly with governments, government of Uganda, government of Rwanda. Everyone's trying to figure out how do they think about the architecture that's going to make data more free-flowing, more equitable use of data, make sure that they can benefit from the revolution that is generative AI. So a lot of our work is really to kind of learn about these frontier topics and then share with funders and policymakers who are really at the heart of some of the big decisions.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I was saying, I have a couple of follow-ups from what you just sort of mentioned. First is, of course, when you speak of funders, who are the stakeholders that you're exactly talking about? If you could sort of enlist them, and are they from public, multilaterals, private entities? So what are the kind of people you work with? And secondly, have been here for 7 years now, but when we think of digital public goods or digital public infrastructure, that's a relatively new item, right? And it gained sort of popularity over the last couple of years, and now everybody seems to be talking about it. So from, say, data exchanges and data governance architectures, when did sort of DIALS shifted its focus, or rather started a new area of focus on DPGs and DPI? So when did that change take place?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, DIAL has always had this broad view that if you can design the kind of foundational building blocks in a way that serves multiple purposes, these kind of reusable building blocks, then, it's not only a more efficient way to think about a national stack, but probably far more effective, because you can imagine then, an ID that's useful for health purposes can then be repurposed and used for banking purposes or whatever. So you kind of pack more punch out of these reusable building blocks. So in fact, that's really been at the heart of DIAL since the very beginning. You can't think about digital infrastructure in these sector silos, like IDs just for health or IDs just for agriculture or whatever. And that's when you get a lot of inefficiencies and kind of confusion, frankly, at the local level. So, I'm glad that the label of digital public infrastructure has come about. It's put a name to the thing that DIAL's been working on for many, many years already. And I think there's lots of debates. Is DPI old wine, new bottles, or is there fundamentally something different? I think there's a lot to unpack there, but at least from DIAL's standpoint, this is kind of an approach, this whole of society approach, reusable building blocks, looking at the foundations of technology, infrastructure as a horizontal. That's really been in the DNA of DIAL since the very beginning.
All right. And on the funders that you mentioned, so who are these entities who are interested in sort of enabling DPIs or other digital architectures across the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's really been kind of a widening pool. I was at USAID, the foreign assistance arm of the US government. We were maybe 10 years ago, the first funder to create a digital development team under my leadership. We had upwards of about 70 people really focused on digital as a horizontal and digital infrastructure. But, we were the first, but certainly not the last. The Brits have just come out with their digital development strategies. The Germans are very, very involved on data issues, data policies, digital infrastructure. The Gates Foundation, Swedish SIDA, JICA out of Japan. There's really a growing cast of characters who have recognized that if we want to accelerate progress against the SDGs, we need every kind of tool in the toolbox deployed. And digital, of course, is one of those. And so I think many of these funders are really recognizing how important it is to get those foundational building blocks, that critical infrastructure in place as an accelerator of social and economic progress.
Yeah, it's heartening to note that there are so many sort of cast of characters that you mentioned who are willing to fund such networks across the globe today. And you sort of said earlier that this might as well be some old wine in new bottle, but I think there's a lot of value in attaching a tag or a label to this sort of network architecture and calling it digital public infrastructure, because now everybody at least knows what they're talking about, right? There is some sort of identity given to that. And I sort of want to know from you, because I understand you were in Davos earlier last week where the World Economic Forum Summit was happening. So what was that experience like? What was the conversation around DPI? Is there a consensus now among the people you spoke to? So yeah, what are your sort of takeaways?
Yeah, this was my first time at Davos, so I didn't really know what to expect. But it's a bunch of conferences within a conference, if that makes sense. And in some ways, there's the formal agenda, what's happening in the Congress Hall, where I would say the big issues on the table were around climate, around governance, Gaza, Ukraine. I mean, all these geopolitical crises, frankly, were very, very much at the table. Separate from the Congress Hall then is, what's happening along the promenade, where all these corporate actors have kind of retrofitted ski shops into, the Microsoft Hall or the MasterCard or Meta or Wipro and Infosys. All of them have this corporate perspective. And it's hard not to walk along the promenade and just feel bombarded with everyone talking about AI. And what was interesting is to think, here are all these crises that government officials are talking about over here in the Congress Hall, and all the corporate actors are very excited about the power of AI. And I can't help but wonder, can those things come together? Is there a way in which, technology can serve these societal goals and, in the midst of some real kind of political wrangling? I don't think there's consensus at all, but it was just interesting that these two things are going on simultaneously. DPI wasn't exactly on the agenda in the same way that, AI is just front and center, but I think in a lot of the private roundtables I was part of, there was a real recognition that so much of the excitement about AI and what it can do to help with health diagnostics or for easing these mundane tasks or, tracking trillions of transactions that might flow through the banking system, so on and so forth. But so much of that benefit really depends on critical infrastructure being in place. So, depends on countries having electricity and connectivity and the foundational DPI that allows for data to flow and therefore to feed the AI engine. And I think there's adequate concern and real concern that the excitement of AI might just pass by lower income countries who just don't have that infrastructure in place. So I'm glad that there was that recognition that this can be more divisive than unifying if we don't get it right. And I think in that way, those who have been caring about digital public infrastructure are really on kind of the right track, saying this is important for closing the divide.
Yeah, from that angle, I was just wondering, I mean, this may be a little futuristic to talk about today, but was there any talk or recognition that, we may need DPI models for foundational AI, or at least generative AI models? Was there anything about that you came across?
Not really. I wish I could say yes. I think it was much more around the architecture that allows for data to be generated, and then to feed into the AI models. I think as much as we're excited about the term DPI and have seen it come to the policy for over the last 18 months, I don't think, the job is done, and the term public is still, or the word public in the term is still a real source of confusion. So, I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I think you strike a skeptical note there, but I sort of want to take this conversation forward with G20, which took place last year in India, right? And that was sort of a key moment in the short history of DPI, because there was a consensus among DPI members who collectively endorsed the DPI for the developing world or the low and middle income countries. But substantively, as an analyst, what has really changed on the ground? Because, of course, politicians love rhetoric. I think DPI may, at a geopolitical level, also be a low-key issue, right? It's not something there'll be much sort of like disagreement, unlike, say, a war or some tension in the Middle East or something like that. So it's easy win for them as well. So if you had to, separate the rhetoric and substantively talk about it, so what are your key takeaways before G20 and after G20, and what sort of like changed on the ground?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's a lot to unpack about the G20 under India's presidency. One is just simply the fact that India was willing to be really bold about sharing their lessons on DPI with the world. I lived in Bangalore for the better part of 2018. And I think there was still a lot of shyness at that point, and maybe the feeling that the jury's still out around how replicable India's experience is elsewhere. And that was a year of tumult. There were lots of concerns about breaches in Aadhaar system. The DIPA framework hadn't yet gotten operationalized. It was still very much in discussion. This was pre-COVID, so you didn't have the kind of experiences of DIVOC where you could show just how quickly you could turn credentialing into a reality. And so in some ways, last year was really powerful, and just in the fact that the Indian government was able to stand up very loudly and say, look, of all the things India has to offer to the world, we're showcasing this, decades plus work to really drive inclusion, and hopefully also data empowerment, and how relevant that is to the world. And I think that in itself was pretty a substantive change, and them showing up in foreign policy circles in a really different way. I think they've put a label on an approach, but a lot has to get sorted out. My biggest worry is then as people are scratching their heads and wondering, okay, what is this thing called DPI, and should I be investing in it or whatever? There's a real concern in my mind that any sort of ID system or any sort of payment system or any effort to exchange data suddenly gets a DPI label, regardless of what kinds of features there are that give people transparency, that give people control, that have real safeguards, data protections, redressal systems all around it. So you could have a situation where literally any ID system, whether it's used for kind of nefarious purposes or not, is labeled DPI. So I don't know that we've gotten to the level of conclusion, almost the definition that allows you to say this is what is good DPI versus not good DPI. And that consensus is still, I think, a ways off. So I'm excited that the term has come to the fore. I'm excited that funders are maybe unlocking new resources for the topic. I just want to make sure we don't kind of fall into this trap of anything that's technology related is somehow labeled good DPI. And, in some ways it creates more confusion than not.
Yeah, actually that's precisely been one of my worries also, and have grappled with this question. And I have hosted quite a few podcasts on DPI, and this question has come up in one way or the other. And I may be sounding a bit cynical here, so forgive me for that. But essentially, is promoting DPI so vigorously going to end up in a situation where we are building surveillance system and handing it over to regimes which may not be democratic, which could as well be autocratic, and which do not sort of support the democratic rights and freedoms that countries, say India or the ones in the West, offer. So would you echo these concerns, or do you think these are blown out of proportions? What do you think?
I absolutely echo the concerns. There's a lot who say, look, if you have a government who has ill intent, right? They don't need DPI to surveil their citizens, right? They can, there's plenty of technologies and access that they have, and we needn't worry about it. I think that's in some ways just a cop-out. To the extent public resources are being utilized to create the foundations of digital infrastructure, it behooves us because of, because of using public resources and because we're doing this in the name of inclusion, that there's, real investment in making sure that the systems have certain permissions and features baked in, that the policy environment is really upholding those democratic norms, that institutions are retrofitted to be responsive in the modern day. So I very, very much echo the concern, while also recognizing that you're right. It's not like, DPI is needed to surveil citizens. It doesn't, but I just think that's a little bit of a cop out.
Yeah, definitely makes it easier.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Any case, moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the work that you and your organization, DIAL, have been doing. And I believe one of your focus areas is Africa, right? I think you have some sort of presence in different African countries and you're helping them with building DPIs and so on. So a couple of questions on that front. So one is what led to the choice of particular countries? And secondly, how has the experience been? Is it difficult to set up and promote a DPI-like architecture in countries where none may exist? And how are you sort of overcoming these challenges?
Yeah, well, Shri, I hope in a future podcast you'll invite Diana Sang, my head of Africa, to join you. I think can give you really rich stories about some of the challenges that she's seeing. But I think just stepping back for a second, I think with all technologies, there's always a risk of greater inequity, greater digital divide, so on and so forth. And so I think our choice in selecting Africa is because that's where a lot of the kind of social and economic need is. That's where the opportunity to support exposure to interesting global and regional practices is. And in some ways, that's where the opportunity to leapfrog is. And when we are talking about kind of a whole of government approach, legacy systems can certainly be a hindrance. So hopefully there's a little bit more of an opportunity to leapfrog. I think there's so much to say about Africa, and the first is that it's not a single country. So, there's situations where you've got 7% connectivity rate in other countries where it's 70%. So I think one of the biggest things for us to be mindful of is this is not a singular conversation with a singular government that has singular experiences. The kind of diversity is so great. And I think the way in which DIAL tries to show up is really to say, here are some interesting practices around how data is getting unlocked or how data is governed or how to think about success in your ID rollout and really try to meet governments where they're at, not to come in with this kind of thou shalt do this kind of approach. So I'm really proud that we take that partnership perspective, try to meet countries where they're at. And as we do so, we're learning as much from them as hopefully they are from us.
Right. And to take up the case of Uganda specifically, since you mentioned it earlier on. So what's happening there? How long have you been there? Are there positive developments that you could sort of speak about? It's just on Uganda.
Yeah, so we're only just starting our engagement in Uganda right now. Is at their request. We were studying Uganda because they represent a leader across the continent in terms of data exchange. They have something called the UG Hub, which is a way for citizens to get access to government services. That UG Hub really only covers a small percentage of the full set of government services. So what part of our research research was just understanding how did UG Hub get up and going? Why, why is only 40% of government services and registries linked to it? What are some of the barriers? And what we realize, this is that as we're researching them and looking also at Mauritius and Rwanda and India and how they've all approached data exchange, here we are looking at this issue, and they requested us to come in and do a workshop alongside them and both explore kind of the art of the possible, to bring in some government ministries who have never really talked to each other. This is something we're doing next month. So I think what it shows to me is as long as you're showing up in a way that's really trying to be constructive, you're trying to expose different practices and considerations, they're coming to us saying, we want to learn what you've learned. We want to understand where Uganda fits in the broader picture of data exchange. Are we a laggard? Are we ahead of the curve? What are some of your ideas? And, it's all very organic and natural. As a kind of subsequent step to all of this, the ID Authority, which is just about to do this very accelerated rollout of MOSIP, the open source ID solution, they also then came to us and said, we really have to be thinking about our KPIs. What does success look like when you're first rolling out MOSIP? What does it look like a year from now and 2 years from now? And again, it's one of those situations where, we don't have all the answers, but it's really, we feel like it's our job to be learning from global experiences in order to come to the table and be constructive and not say, this is how you should do it, but here's how Bangladesh has thought about their KPIs and what's within the realm of control of, and what isn't. So that's kind of how we like to work, more in that partnership model, hopefully bringing ideas and expertise beyond, our staff, but really these kind of global experiences to bear. And I think it's worth remembering there's not one country who has figured this out around how to drive a very radically inclusive digital economy, one that underpins those democratic norms and rights that you were talking about, and that has really fostered innovation and healthy competitive markets. And those three legs of the stool, nobody's figured it out. So it's not like Dial's job is to come in and say, here's how you should do it. It's more, here's how different countries have approached trying to get those three legs right. And if we can be a partner in that, I think we'll have done a real service in just exposing good practices, inspiring some, new approaches, and really making sure that throughout it all, we're really focused on people being at the heart of the conversation.
Yeah, just on the fact that you mentioned that the ministries have not spoken to each other, that's fairly common in India as well. And that has led to a series of policy screw-ups over the year, but that's a separate conversation. But what struck me towards the end of your comments was you spoke about the third leg being the competitive aspect of it, or rather the potential for commercialization of a lot of this public infrastructure that is being built, right? And that's interesting because I think, one, that drives a lot of innovation. And we have seen this in India, how fintechs have boomed, how underwriting costs have come down for businesses when they're sanctioning loans or when they're onboarding new customers and so on. And I think there's a strong push to be made that this has positive externalities in the terms of the kind of economy, the kind of growth, the jobs, and the commercial opportunities that it can create. So how strong is this pitch, say, in Uganda or elsewhere where such infrastructures don't exist? Say, for example, if you talk about fintech, is there any development at all? What's happening on that front?
Yeah. Well, I want to go first back to your first point, which is government doesn't talk to one another. I think it's really easy if you haven't been in government to think that just seems crazy that it doesn't happen. But having worked in government for 8 years, I'll say that, there's not always the incentive to be kind of working across agencies and ministries. You've got a job to do. And the idea of like waiting on someone else, outside of your agency just feels totally contrary to how government is set up. So this isn't, and I can say this it's true in the US governments, it's true in European governments, it's true all over the world that these silos exist. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of almost project management support from the outside to get those wheels turning. And that's, maybe it sounds really simplistic, but sometimes it is literally just the organization who says, come to this lunch, come meet your colleagues, come think about this. Let's, here's how it's been approached elsewhere. It's kind of a universal challenge. You're going to have to ask me another question. I can't remember where you were going.
Yeah, so I was asking about the potential for commercialization of a lot of aspects.
Yeah.
Or rather like enabling sort of new innovation in, say, financial markets and so on.
Yeah. Look, I think there's two things here around the commercialization. One is to the extent we're really trying to like sell a vision around digital public infrastructure as kind of we know it from India's standpoint, it's really important to show how the pie has grown. So maybe, any given country might have to give up a percentage of market share, but the overall market share grows, right? And I think there's a lot to still be done and shown around why DPI can really drive inclusion and competition and why even the kind of big players should care. There's a second question around commercialization, which I think is a little more interesting, which is, for countries that don't have the talent and the wherewithal and the political will and so on and so forth that India has had and that Estonia has had, to what extent can you rely on commercial entities to be the providers of this infrastructure that is supposed to serve the public benefit, right? So can a government regulate and license the deployment of an ID system that is, it's core public infrastructure, but maybe because of all these challenges government faces, it just doesn't seem possible to have that ID registration, maintenance, all the cybersecurity around it, all of that really led by the public sector. And I think that's a really kind of frontier question that's worth us asking. And to me, it all comes down to rent seeking. So what's exciting about the DPI in India is the government has basically said, this is such critical infrastructure for our economy. We want to design it in a way that is not profit maximizing. It's sustainable and we're using taxpayer dollars to have this infrastructure in place because we need it to be as inclusive as possible. We need as many people, in the banking sector and, in the healthcare sector, and it is just a position that the government took. So the question in my mind is is there a way to rely on the private sector more and have them be deploying and maintaining and kind of keeping secure this infrastructure, but in a way, again, that is radically inclusive. And I don't know that we've explored that topic enough, but I would say that as it relates to a lot of the countries in Africa, there's a greater appreciation for the need to rely on the private sector and to commercialize this infrastructure but we have to get that kind of rent-seeking equation right.
Yeah, because it's already happened in India, right? For example, if you look at UPI payment system, that although it is promoted by the government, the actual entity, the capital has come from banks and financial institutions and insurance companies and so on. And some of them are in the public sector, of course, but some are private banks and private companies as well. But of course, it's rightly regulated by the central bank. It is supposed to be a non-profit operating entity and so on. So it comes with a series of regulation. But again, private actors are more than willing to fund this because they see net benefits from enabling this sort of like a payment system. Anyway, moving on a little bit from here, a question about US, where you reside and work from. I believe how US looks at DPI is going to be vastly different from, say, how a LMIC country looks at it, right? But the challenges are different, of course, because US may not have the same sort of connectivity or financing sort of problems. So from that viewpoint, what's different or how important is for a developed country, say the US or a country somewhere in Europe, to invest and build DPIs today?
Well, there's lots of reasons the US cares. And I think the landscape has changed a lot. Here we are in 2024 versus when I was in government. And one of the big shifts is just the great recognition that there are these downside risks and harms related to digitization. And a lot of that comes down to issues of data. Who's collecting data? How's it being shared? What kind of transparency or controls are there over people? So in 2018, of course, Cambridge Analytica in some ways was like the great, shift in this direction of recognizing that maybe the US doesn't have it all figured out. We might have thriving tech sector and, lots of incredible innovations coming out of the West Coast. But there's something that needs to be gotten right as it relates to data governance and data architecture. And I think that has kind of opened the door to the US really recognizing that there's a role for government to assert some leadership around how infrastructure is designed and deployed and governed. I think, of course, the second thing is so I think that whole issue means that the U.S. government is not so tightly tied with the commercial interests of the U.S., right? There's a little more of a fracture there, and there's a real recognition that something has to get kind of figured out. I think, of course, the second thing is just around what's happened or not happened on the Sustainable Development Goals, and just what we're seeing coming out of COVID, that there's just incredible economic setbacks. There's governments around the world who are under pressure to deliver for their citizens. You're seeing in Africa, those governments who are not able to effectively deliver services are really, really, there's all sorts of governments across the continent who are being overthrown because they're not able to deliver. So I think the U.S. foreign policy world is also recognizing that something has to be done to really strengthen the government-citizen experience to make sure that these kind of limited resources are helping support public service delivery. So I think there's a combination of things that have made the U.S. More receptive to the DPI argument. And of course, the third one being geopolitical. There's this sense of kind of a war of ideas going on out there as countries are digitizing. Do you want a model where data gets centralized into for government use and control, and perhaps surveillance, or do you want something else? And I think the whole DPI argument is really one that speaks to the US sensibilities of democratic norms, more choice given to people, more competition in the marketplace, and create a framework wherein companies can compete. So I think it speaks to some of those sensibilities. So on all three fronts, the kind of commercial front, the foreign policy front, some of these geopolitical issues going on, it's made the US much more receptive.
Right. So a final question to you before we sort of close this chat, and this is not particularly about DPI, but about your work generally, which is that you run a think tank and advocacy organization, and you were in the government before. Now you're outside it, but you still work with the government in US and elsewhere. So I think you have a lot of experience to answer this question. So at Takshashila, we train students in public policy. We offer them graduate level programs, and one of the modules is essentially how to bring about change, right? How to affect change, because the point of studying public policy is essentially to go out and make a difference later on. And we do this series called Organize for Change, where we get change makers like you to come and speak to our students. But that's actually a longer conversation. So I'm really asking you to summarize here. So if one had to think of 3 or 4 practical lessons that you had to share with everybody as to how to work in this field, and what sort of takeaways do you have in terms of bringing about change, in terms of working with the government, what are those, right? And one thing you already mentioned is, about the connectivity issue in Africa, and that speaks of an important lesson that, be aware of the local context. What are the sort of other practical lessons you would like to share today?
Well, Shri, I think you touched on probably the most important one. Ideas are a dime a dozen, right? But the capacity to act on those ideas is not. And I think institutions like yours that are doing the work to invest in the next generation of leaders who are thinking about the ethics and the technology and how those things can come together, there's no shortcut to that. And, I think it's a little too bad we're in this world where everyone's like, especially on the funder side, like, what have you done for me lately? There's a real pressure to see adoption and scale and, lives should be changed by yesterday kind of mentality. But, a lot of the a lot of this is change management at the end of the day. And as I said earlier, there aren't exact answers to the questions we're asking around how do you make sure you're really driving democratic norms and radical inclusion in the digital future. So the hard work of just building up the base of people who aren't afraid to ask questions, who know a little bit about technology, who know a little bit about legislative models, all of that is just really, really critical. And if I could have one wish, it would just be to massively invest in those kinds of capacity building efforts. And I think what you see is that decades later, there's real payoffs. And we've seen that time and time again coming out of the US, US programs to support, let's say, good practices in journalism, right? That those can have incredible payoff later in unexpected ways. The other thing I would say in terms of just a wish list is I think it's really, we're in a moment of polycrisis, right? And, what issues are we trying to solve now is, there's only so much attention you can give to any one thing. I think we in the DPI world really need to connect our issues to the big pressing problems of the day, like climate change. And I think we need to do a much better job of having the measurement, that kind of outcomes framework clarified. So what do I mean by that? Like 20 years ago, I started my career in the financial inclusion space, and there was literally no way to tell anyone how many people in the world had a liquid savings account. There was just no measure of it. And to the extent there were some signals around, access to savings accounts, they were all very supply side heavy. There wasn't a lot of information about how people were utilizing their accounts, whether they were interest bearing or not, whether they met a need that they couldn't find elsewhere in the market. I mean, there were just not a lot of demand side measurements. And now the world's really changed. You've got Global Microscope and you have Findex and you have other tools that allow you to say, this is where we are on the financial inclusion journey and where women are and where, Zambia is versus Zimbabwe or whatever. There's much more benchmarking. And I think if we're going to really take advantage of the moment around the kind of new momentum around DPI, one of the big things we have to invest in are those measurement tools so we can know where we are as a world. How many countries have a data protection law in place? How many of those data protection laws are meaningfully enforced or really give people any sort of transparency or control over the data? We don't have any of that information at our fingertips. So we can't be effective in the research or in the advocacy without those that outcome framework and those measurement tools. So between the capacity building work and the measurement, those are probably the two highest on my wish list.
Yeah, that's great. I think you flagged off a very important area where a lot more work is possible. And I hope some of our listeners would be interested in taking this up because, like you rightly pointed out, I think it's about time we create some indices to sort of measure the outcomes of DPI. And we know what we are talking about in a much more holistic sense, right? So anyway, thanks a lot, Priya, for joining me on this conversation today and sharing your insights with us. We hope to have you and Del back on All Things Policy for a future episode whenever it's convenient. So thanks once again for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.